My name is David Daniel Ball, and these are the headlines for Thursday, the 29th of January, 2009. Rees asks Rudd for $2.5 billion hospital handout. Church schools to ban gay teachers and hijabs. Man arrested for stalking young girls. 50 million jobs will be lost in 2009, say the International Labour Organization. Government handouts prompt $500 million pokies boom. 3 teens die in Victorian car crash. New South Wales Labour set to promote Robertson. 2 charged over Queensland double murder. Hamas would recognise pre-1967 Israel. Wen and Putin blame US over economic crisis. In comments, fighting for the right to speak without fear by Piers Ackerman. Freedom of speech and the free press are among the freedoms we take for granted in Australia. To those unfortunate enough to live in other nations, principally those outside the West, such freedoms are as rare as clean water. In my comment, I feel a little uncomfortable saying that a major difference between free Australia and dictatorship elsewhere is our rule of law, which embraces liberal freedoms. Because it often doesn't. It fails. Yet in its failure, we still have moderate to high success. When the question was posed to the Senate last year if the Department of Education had paid attention to the grave accusations made by David Ball, the reply was interesting for what it failed to provide, highlighting my point. The answer suggested there was a struggle in the bureaucracy to determine if David was a teacher who had a job. The answer then gave a long-winded no to the question. So a grave accusation was made and the government admits in Parliament that it ignored it, suggesting that the government was struggling to know what epistemologically a teacher is. But to say that Australia is successful only because of a culture is to overvalue one thing and to deny those that have fought so hard to preserve that culture. In short, I think we need more than the right to be able to speak without fear. We also have and need the right to be heard. From Tim Blair. Big list, even bigger. Remember that consensus we used to hear so much about? Retired senior NASA atmospheric scientist Dr. John S. Theon, the former supervisor of James Hansen, NASA's vocal man-made global warming fear soothsayer, has now publicly declared himself a skeptic and declared that Hansen embarrassed NASA with his alarming climate claims and said Hansen was never muzzled. Theon joins the rapidly growing ranks of international scientists abandoning the promotion of man-made global warming fears. I appreciate the opportunity to add my name to those who disagree that global warming is man-made. Theon wrote to the Minority Office at the Environment and Public Works Committee on January the 15th, 2009. Message the same. The anti-immigration slogan, F off, we're full, was displayed by many stupid and destructive kids during the Australia Day. Much condemnation followed. Next year, these youngsters should just explain that they are deeply concerned environmentalists who are worried about our ecological sustainability, and that way they can avoid controversy. From Andrew Bolt, Melbourne crumbles, government to fall. Melbourne now pays the price of being too green and mushy to build infrastructure to match its booming population and even to cope with the weather. Water. Melbourne's summer water storage levels have slumped to their lowest point in 25 years. Yarra Valley Water Management Director Tony Kelly said Victorians were now using an unacceptable amount of water. Power. Tens of thousands of houses sweltered through the night as sizzling heat caused power outages across the state. These extreme temperatures and excessive use of air conditioning can impact on the electricity distribution network, Mr. Beatty said. Transport. Melbourne's train system buckled under the strain of Wednesday's heat, forcing maintenance workers to cool the rails with water, but commuters were left boiling mad after enduring more than 150 cancelled services in one of the system's worst days in recent memory. Public Transport Minister Lynn Koski has blamed underinvestment over a long period of time as a key factor in the poor performance of Melbourne's public transport network in recent weeks. Meanwhile, having spent so much with so little to show, the Victorian government is close to breaking one of its promises to voters, with the budget close to slipping into the red for the first time in 15 years. Water restrictions, power cuts, cancelled trains, choked freeways. This government is now heading for a shock defeat at the next election. But at least Victoria isn't yet New South Wales. Senior doctors at Dubbo Base Hospital are threatening to quit after running out of morphine and watching patients in the intensive care unit swelter in 37-degree heat for 5 days because pharmaceutical companies and maintenance contractors had not been paid. The last hospitals I heard of that were running out of morphine were in African war zones. Good for unions, bad for jobs. Have you noticed that Kevin Rudd's economic reforms tend to come with very nasty unintended consequences? The commercial shipping industry has warned the Rudd government that it could move its operations and hundreds of jobs offshore because of the new industrial relations laws. Bligh's bounty of gases. Queensland Premier Ann Bligh wants the state's children to cut their planet-murdering emissions. We are working to put Queensland out ahead of the pack to make Queensland schools world leaders in reducing their carbon emissions. Bligh herself, though, gasses on in her personal jet, the only one allocated to any state premier. Queensland Premier Anna Bligh has breached her government's guidelines by flying in the state government-owned jet at a cost to taxpayers of $3,000 an hour to watch football. The guidelines were sidestepped for a trip by Ms. Bligh and Sports Minister Judy Spence in September 2007 in the jet to Townsville to watch a rugby league match between Queensland Cowboys and the New Zealand Warriors. Being green kills the planet. For a green believer, it's like a sheet of paper with "please turn over" printed on both sides. Peter Jones suggested an urgent review of Labour's policy on recycling was needed to make sure the collection, transportation, processing of recyclable material was not causing a net increase in greenhouse gases. Mr. Jones, a former director of the waste firm Biffa and now an advisor to environment ministers and the London Mayor, suggested that much of the country's waste should simply be burnt to generate electricity. Meanwhile, yet more evidence that recycling is a gigantic con, or at best a mere genuflection. Last month, the Daily Telegraph disclosed that councils in England and Wales were dumping more than 200,000 tonnes of recyclable waste every year. Up to 10% of all the waste, glass, paper, plastic, and other materials separated out by householders. Thousands of tons of recyclables are shipped to China because of insufficient capacity and demand in Britain. In some parts of the country, residents have to sort out their waste into as many as 7 containers, including food waste bins, which has helped councils to justify the scrapping of weekly bin collections. A reminder, politics is only a sin of the right. Fox News reports Obama urges the GOP to keep politics to a minimum on the stimulus. And from the Wall Street Journal, this report on Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the most senior Democrat in Congress. Pelosi lashes out at Bush and McCain over the financial crisis. Grandchildren have been stolen. The We Know Better Brigade in Britain has astonishing powers to meddle in the most intimate of family relationships. 2 young children are to be adopted by a gay couple despite the protests of their grandparents. The devastated grandparents were told they would never see their youngsters again unless they dropped their opposition. The couple, who cannot be named, wanted to give the 5-year-old boy and his 4-year-old sister a loving home themselves, but they were ruled to be too old at 46 and 59.